There seems to be a disconnect between backgrounding in sport and training. In the gym, it's seen as something that's bad and dangerous, yet in sport, it's unavoidable and not really seen as that dangerous. In fact, sometimes an athlete's prowess is praised because it seems like it's some amazing athletic feat, but it's only an amazing athletic feat because it's so demonized and is not trained. So everyone else is weak there, but that athlete has been doing it through their whole career. Now, this concept extends beyond just backgrounding, but I'm only going to focus on that for the video. I've previously made a reel on this, and it was met with a lot of comments that were saying that backgrounding is 1, more injurious, and 2, it's worse for performance. And both of these statements are just wrong, and I'm going to kind of break that down for you. So starting off with the injury aspect of it, it's just not being shown to actually be more injurious. I've gone over this many times, and that really just stems from these dead pig spine studies where they take the segments and bend them back and forth beyond their normal range of motion for up to a whole day until the disc or end plate gives out. Now, the methods of these studies can't really be extrapolated to living human conditions, especially because they don't take into consideration the rest and recovery between them, and loading just doesn't happen like that in real life conditions. So these studies themselves are flawed with the extrapolation and generalizability to actual human living conditions, but they're used in further studies that look at different positions, especially backgrounding, and find forces going through the back. Then these studies take that, hey, there's forces going through the back, and since this dead pig spine study shows that the disc will give out at some point under these conditions, they then wrongfully conclude that that position is bad to be in and is harmful and more injurious. But again, these conclusions and discussions are based on a flawed base.
You sit on a throne of lies.
So that makes the conclusion and discussion itself flawed and incorrect. This is also just flawed thinking because forces aren't inherently dangerous. They're just forces. Whenever you move, and even if you're just sitting still, there's forces going through your body. That's just how life works. Forces going through your body is also how your body adapts. So when you do a movement, let's say a bicep curl, for example, you're putting forces through your elbow joint, through your bicep muscle. Those forces then get your body to send signals to make those areas stronger so that it can better withstand the weight and forces being applied to it. I know I'm saying forces a lot, but I hope you're following along. So forces just stress on the body, and the body responds to that by getting stronger to better withstand it. If you're always trying to avoid these forces, then your body's just going to get weaker as a result. Because the body's very efficient, it doesn't want to use up extra energy by keeping extra tissue around. It's going to try to save energy by decreasing the tissue and keeping your body at its minimal viable amount just to do what it needs to do. So if you're always avoiding a position or always avoiding a movement, then you're going to get weaker. So all in all, forces aren't bad and they're actually a good thing. These studies showing, hey, forces go through this joint or forces go through this muscle are kind of flawed and, in my opinion, sort of useless because they just get used to demonize and they don't put it in the greater context of things. The other part of this argument that involves flawed thinking is that in back-dominant sports, you see more back injuries. So then, therefore, those positions are bad. Now, I'm going to let you think this through before I answer. Like, really think it through. Okay, so if a certain body part is used more than other body parts, which part do you think is more likely to get injured? Right, the one that's getting used more. That's just the reality of sport. You're pushing your body to its limits to maximize your performance, and injuries are bound to happen. If you use a certain area of your body more, then that's getting way more use. And statistically, if it has the same chance of getting injured as somewhere that you're using less, it's probably going to see more injuries. So if you use your back 50 times more than your ankles, like in rowing, you're probably a lot more likely to see back injuries compared to ankle injuries because your back is the part of your body that you're actually using. So the flaw in that thinking is that they aren't taking the relative use of each body part into consideration when they're looking at the injury rates. So for example, in sports that use the shoulder more, like a baseball pitcher, you're going to see more shoulder injuries. For sports that use the groin more, like in hockey, especially goaltenders, you're going to see more groin injuries. If you do a lot of sprinting, like in soccer or sprinting, then you're going to see a lot more hamstring injuries because that's getting used more. And if you play a sport like darts, then you're going to have a lot more liver disease because you have to process tons of alcohol. So these studies that just show injury rates themselves with certain sports also aren't really all that useful. They often don't discuss the relative use of each body part and how that is reflected in the injury rates. It's not that these movements are bad, it's just that these body parts are getting used more because that's what the sport calls for, and that's the demands of the sport. So often these injury rate studies get used to demonize movement and fearmonger certain movement, but they don't talk about the bigger, more powerful contributing factors like capacity for that movement. For example, how much range can that person tolerate? Do they ever do backgrounding in their training? How much weight can they tolerate? How much frequency can they tolerate? Do they ever actually train it to build up capacity? No, because it gets demonized. So when people are inevitably forced into these positions because their sport calls for it, then they're going to be thrown into it way above their capacity, and that's where injury is more likely to occur. Now, we can also use these other sports to kind of show how there's this disconnect between certain movements and their training. So for the pitchers, they do a lot of shoulder work in order to prevent shoulder injuries. Hockey players work their groins a ton. Soccer players and sprinters do a ton of hamstring work, but rowers and combat sport athletes, you don't really see them doing much backgrounding exercise because that movement is demonized. Now, I know there are some wrestlers that do some Zercher deadlifts and other backgrounding movements. You're the good ones. Hell yeah. But tons of people are taught that they should avoid doing direct back work because it's bad and that for some reason the back can't handle it. Maybe the back can't handle it because they never train it, and then when they go into it, it's well above their capacity. Just have to find the right starting point. And honestly, even the ab muscles and the QLs aren't really worked through a range of motion because twisting and side bending is even considered dangerous. So they're just worked in isometric fashion, and these athletes aren't getting used to being in those awkward positions or getting strong in as many positions as they could that would actually benefit them. The dogma that bending the back is bad is detrimental, and in my opinion, it's not actually decreasing injury rates, but instead it could potentially be increasing injury rates because it's lowering people's capacity for that movement. The fear leads to avoidance of the movement, which leads to decreased capacity, and then in sport, that position is unavoidable, and a lot of the times it's more beneficial, so then they're being put into it above their capacity. This is a recipe for disaster. And also, the danger of dogma and research is very important to understand and very important to call out. It's important to understand the source information that the authors are basing their discussion and conclusions on so that you can actually see what the limitations of their conclusions are, what the study is actually showing, and if it lines up with what they're actually saying. Sometimes people are just misled and they follow the dogma and it gets put out in papers. Honestly, that happens more often than not. So you can't just blindly trust titles, abstracts, conclusions, and discussions. You kind of have to do a little bit more digging yourself. And now this brings me to the second point of this video, which is performance. A lot of people were saying that, lifting with a straight back is better for performance, but sometimes you just end up in that rounded back position. Now, this is just straight up wrong, and I've made other videos on this kind of talking about how deadlifting with a rounded back is actually more beneficial, stronger, and more efficient. But that doesn't just apply to powerlifting. It applies to any time you have to lift a weight, anytime you have to do some sort of pulling movement like in rowing, or when you have to lift a human being. Especially when you have to lift a human being because it's an awkward position and an awkward weight, so you're going to have to do whatever you have to do to move them. So to start, when you keep your back straight, you're actually making it harder for yourself. I'm going to talk about how this affects the hip extensors, which is the glutes and hamstrings, and I'm mainly going to use combat sports as an example. If you're going to keep your back straight when you need to pick up and throw your opponent, then you need to get lower by bending more at the hips, knees, and ankles. Doing this, especially bending at the hips, puts your glutes and hamstrings at a longer muscle length. And typically when muscles are at longer lengths, they're not as good at producing force. As a side note, this can be great for hypertrophy, but when you're in sport and you're trying to produce as much force as possible to outdo your opponent, this is not a good thing and this is a negative. You want to be as strong as possible. And if we're talking specifically about the glute max here, I think there are some studies showing that past about 35 degrees of hip flexion, it starts to lose that force production capability. I don't know how solid that research is, and I haven't read it in a while, so I can't quite remember the number exactly, so take that information with a grain of salt. But the key takeaway with that is that the more you flex your hips, the weaker your glute max is going to be. So before that point is when it's going to be its strongest. So if you're keeping your back straight, you have to get well beyond that range of hip flexion, and you're just playing yourself and throttling your force output. Now, the second point is that when you keep your back straight, you're making your opponent further away from your main axis of rotation, which is going to be your hip joint. And every single segment in your spine is another axis of rotation, so you're also making it harder on your spinal erectors, but I'll talk more about that later. So when you increase the distance of a weight from the axis of rotation, you're increasing the amount of force that you have to produce to overcome that weight. So in other words, you're relatively making that weight heavier. And when you do that, now your glutes and hamstrings have to work even harder in order to bring your body and the opponent up to get that throw off. So by keeping your back straight, you're not only making your opponent relatively heavier, but you're also nerfing your own force output and making it harder for you to produce that force. So you're playing yourself from both sides. Now, I want to bring up this clip to demonstrate that point. So as you can see here, this wrestler's picking up his opponent and he has a pretty rounded back. Now, if he were to keep his back straight, he would have to get much lower. This would make it harder for him to produce the force and make his opponent feel heavier. And then another side note on this is that in the context of sport, time is of the essence. So if he took that time to get lower, that would give his opponent time to change position and get more brace to resist the pull and resist the throw. So instead, he lifts with a rounded back, is strong with it, brings the opponent up, and then he readjusts to get better leverages to finish the throw. This is really similar to what strongmen do when they're lifting Atlas stones. So they round their back, get the stone close to the axis of rotation, lift it up to their lap, and then readjust so that they can get in better position for leveraging the full extension to get the stone up onto the platform. This is just showing that you have to use the proper movement strategy when it's there. If you blanket it and say you have to always keep a straight back, you're just decreasing your performance and you're limiting your movement capabilities. Sport calls for a lot of different positions and you need to be able to adapt to them and produce force in them. So all in all, having that rounded back position allowed that wrestler to produce more force to pick up his opponent and then get the throw. Now moving on to the rowers. The clip that I used in that video as well as in this video were from Olympic gold medalists. So they were at the top of their game. These are high level rowers. And also, it wasn't from the end of a race. This was from the very beginning, so they were fresh. So a key point is that this was at the beginning of the race. These rowers were trying to accelerate, so they needed to produce as much force as possible, or more force at least, within their capacity. You don't want to burn out right at the start. And so their bodies were getting in the most efficient and strongest position to produce that force, which is a rounded back position. Putting that blanket statement out that you always need to keep a straight back is not good for performance. Having that rounded position can be more efficient, more strong, and situationally, way more effective. So it's better to not demonize it, but instead build up the capacity so that you can use it when you have to. I've really been talking a lot about the hip extensors, and now I also want to talk about the spinal erectors. So like I said earlier, every single spinal segment is also another axis of rotation. So keeping your back straight could potentially make it more difficult for your spinal erectors to keep that position since the moment arm is longer, especially at those lower lumbar segments. Again, there's also some evidence showing that a slightly rounded position could be better for force production for the spinal erectors as well as the thoracolumbar fascia. Again, these studies aren't super amazing, but if they're going to use dead pig spine studies where they flex them back and forth beyond their normal range of motion to make a counter argument, then I think this study is more than sufficient. Okay, before some people decide to make some brain dead comments and say, well, lifting with a fully rounded back is bad, and that I'm encouraging people to go out there and lift or do sports with a fully rounded back. No, I'm not. If you were listening, I said that muscles at longer muscle lengths typically have less force production capabilities. This also applies to the muscles of the back. So if you lift with a fully rounded back, you're not maximizing your force production capabilities. And in sport, if you perform that movement with a fully rounded back, your force production capabilities are going to be compromised. Will you get in that position sometimes in sport? Yes, but I'm not saying that every time you do that movement, you have to have a fully rounded back. So just take a second, take a deep breath, and think a little bit through what I said instead of having emotional response. And to kind of wrap that all up, a completely straight back isn't good for force production, and a completely rounded back isn't good for force production. So finding that sweet spot in the middle that works best for you is going to be your best bet. This is why when you look at top level deadlifters, they're going to have some rounding in their back when they're lifting max weights. One, whenever the hips flex, the spine rounds. It's unavoidable and inevitable. And two, it's a more efficient and stronger position. So to kind of restate what I said in the beginning, I think there's a disconnect between how back rounding is seen in sport and competition versus how it's seen in training and in the weight room. This demonizing of back rounding leads to avoidance of it in training in the weight room, which leads to a decrease in the athlete's capacity to do that movement and could potentially be hindering performance and increasing injury in the back. Anytime someone bends forward at the hips to get into a deeper amount of hip flexion, their spine is going to round. It's inevitable and unavoidable, and is especially prominent in sports. So this movement doesn't need to be demonized so much, but instead, it should be encouraged to find a good entry point for it and build it up so you have the performance capabilities and the resilience in that movement. Finding that nice, easy entry point is key. You don't have to rush the progression, just start with what's manageable and then slowly build it up over time. I have coached people to get into this, and I've started at body weight with a lot of them. I myself started with a 20-pound bar. Then take small jumps. You can limit the range of motion, you can limit the frequency, you can limit the weight, and slowly build that up over time. This could even take months or years. That's okay. There's no need to rush the progression. Go with what is manageable for your body and what you can recover from. So again, it's very important to find a very manageable starting point and then slowly progress it. And for my sake, from a legal standpoint, don't start any new movements without the guidance of a professional, and don't start any new exercise programs without the guidance of a professional. Always seek some outside help, and this is just educational and is not medical advice. I hope this video has helped you to open your mind and think a little bit more. Now go out there and make some gains.